Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures, a show where my guests and I get to explore entrepreneurial stories, market landscapes, problem spaces, and examine together how new ventures might be able to be created, either for-profit, nonprofit, or personal ventures, to benefit humanity. Really, the purpose of this show is to educate and inspire a new generation of venture builders and venture investors to make the world a better place. In today's episode, my guest is Joel Fariss, and if you remember from a couple episodes ago, he and I talked about design and work and the future of humanity. And today we're going to extend that conversation to discuss this concept of virtual identities. Identity in and of itself is a very difficult problem from a technological angle. It's hard to identify that people are who they say they are, but now add the additional complexity of virtual identities, that we can create new forms of people, even new forms of ourselves that can interact in new global economies in a Web3 era, and the implications of that are wide-ranging and potentially amazing, but also potentially terrible. So we dive into that a fair amount. If you are listening, you can also watch this show by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the different topics that we talk about today. And if you are watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcast. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Joel Fariss. All right, Joel, welcome back.
Great to be back. Super fun.
So last time we had an amazing conversation getting into the nuances of design, the epistemology of design, how that relates to our thinking as humans, the desire for entrepreneurs who are designing things to actually think about making humanity better, and ultimately getting into even the DE&I implications, the role of grief in the workplace as it relates to everything that we're learning in the pandemic today. So I'm excited today to dive into a bunch of topics that we didn't get to last time. You sent me recently a video from Kim Kardashian that Kanye had given her a gift of a virtual avatar of her passed away father,
right?
Giving a very heartwarming hello and remembrance to Kim as a hologram. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the implications are for us as we think about the AI takeover here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know you all at Proto have been thinking about Web 3.0 and a lot of these ideas. And so I was sharing that as just another example. I think that the technology is exploding so quickly around virtual identities, and this new, frontier of virtual experience. And I think that, VR is not a new technology. I mean, I think, VR has been used in one way or form going back maybe even to the 60s. Jaron Lanier really popularized and perpetuated kind of mainstream VR in the social consciousness of our culture. But over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen the technology just continue to snowball in some really amazing ways. And I think when we think about Web 3.0, we think about XR technologies, and we think about the future of human experience. There's all sorts of things colliding, from simulated people, right, with their own voice and their own face and their own presence, to these virtual worlds and experiences that are becoming more and more accessible and kind of floating to the surface in the age of distributed work via the pandemic. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening there, and I really do believe that this is where kind of we're going to begin to encounter some of the existential crises that futurists and others, ethicists and researchers, have been warning of for the last 20, 30 years or so. And I think that this is also the space where there's going to be the greatest opportunity to really transform. I mean, I think it's going to be an inflection point of sorts.
Mm.
It might be a threshold in the history of human evolution that we may be living through, where there's the dystopias like the Matrix and what was that Netflix Carbon something, right? Where
Altered Carbon.
Ultimate Carbon or Altered Carbon, right? Which was an amazing show. So there's these dystopian worlds, right? That kind of go down that road, right? Where all humans are going to become batteries for machines and things of that sort. There's also, though, the utopian visions. And I think that, whenever we cross these kinds of thresholds and when these kinds of technologies that promise such a radical transformation, or at least the potential for a radical transformation of what it means to be human, we need to feel and carry the weight of that as technologists, right? And as people building platforms and systems and software and tools and rethinking processes and policies and experiences as to where and how these technologies are used. And think about what are the functional fictions, so to speak? What are the narrative scaffolds that we need to stand up to ensure that collectively the story we begin to tell of the trajectory of human civilization is moving towards one that, again, like we were discussing last time, is one of shared prosperity and equity, and not one that continues to stratify economically, socially, and culturally. And I think with technology like, virtual avatars, and, I was saying earlier that Microsoft just filed a patent to create chatbots based on social feeds. So you and I could go plug in all of our social feeds into a chatbot, and the AI would take all of that content and create basically a virtual chatbot of us, right? But the implications for that is you could do it also for people who maybe are recently deceased. You could do it for people who have been long gone for hundreds of years, even if they've got a pretty large library of written and published works. Those already, right, avatars and AIs who are rapping, right, who are writing poetry based on, you select a few poets and you write the first line and it autofills it for you.
Right, the GPT.
There's a lot of that. Right, exactly. So I think that it really provokes some really fun and interesting questions and opportunities. But at the end of the day, what Kanye did for Kim, I think in 10 years, that's just going to be the norm. I think that will each of us have a virtual identity that exists in avatar form, showing up and sitting at the virtual conference table, so to speak, with us, right?
With us or in place of us?
I think both. I think the big opportunity, and I've yet to really see anyone, so if there's entrepreneurs out there, this is an idea for you. And we've been talking about this a little bit. The next, what I believe to be the next Google will essentially be, or the next Apple will be essentially a skill marketplace for virtual avatars, right? Where it's a platform and a marketplace where people are developing skill sets, and you can buy the skill for your avatar. So just like in the Matrix, when Trinity downloads the helicopter pilot instructions, right? It's going to be very similar to that. The technology in terms of the building blocks all exist. It's now, and just like most new technology, it's a matter of just bolting things together. And I think that there's going to be some really interesting stuff coming out of that.
So in the Web3 era, identity is a huge problem. A lot of different groups are tackling this idea of how do you know, especially in a decentralized architecture, how do you know that you are you, that a human or somebody on the system is actual representing a single human somewhere on Earth? That in and of itself is a huge problem. But then you're saying this is another level, which I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, or even the concept of identity. If we have virtual identities representing different facets of ourselves. I mean, in one sense, this is already happening, right? Every teenager, it sounds like, has 4 or 5, 6 different personas online. Even within Instagram itself, they'll have 6 or 7 Instagram accounts with different identities, different masks that they put on, so to speak. And this is kind of the norm these days. How, what you said earlier in terms of the crisis, the multiple crises that we're going to be facing around identity, what do you see those are? What do you see that those might be as we approach the relatively near future here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think identity is an interesting thing. I think that there's a lot of debate as to what identity is. Consciousness itself is a very fuzzy thing and not really understood. It's very there's so many layers to it, right? I tend to think of identity as it's the perception of self in as much as it's affirmed or negated by those around you in your immediate vicinity. And so I think with virtual identities, the strength of that identity or the function or the efficacy of that identity, in as much as it serves you as a human being, as soon as we have limited energies and limited focus, right? So the more that you fragment your attention and your time and your energy to various expressions of yourself, I think the less grounded you'll be, right? And I think that what we need right now more than ever is grounded people. We need grounded human beings. We need human beings who are comfortable with nuance and ambiguity. We need human beings who are willing to empathize and hear and receive contradictory opinions. We need there's a socially and politically and economically and otherwise, like, I think a lot of the challenges that we're facing, we are facing because we're already overwhelmed, right? Just trying to manage one worldview and one value system and one set of beliefs in one time and place with one community is already overwhelming. we're already having a hard time trying to bust through those tribal constructs, right? And so I think what happens is, if you think about these affinity groups as tribal constructs that are now beginning to battle each other, and over the last 20 years we've seen, you've got Antifa and you've got incels and you've got the Proud Boys, and you've got all these different groups that are becoming subgroups. And I think with virtual identity, what happens is those subgroups begin to fork and proliferate to more and more smaller subgroups. And so what you end up with ultimately is kind of the complete dissolution of any sense of social unity or shared culture. And I think that's going to be a really challenging thing. So I don't fully, have maybe any sort of I don't have any answers necessarily. I just think these are some of the things that we're going to be facing. I think we're already overwhelmed. And so I think the challenge is how might we cultivate this kind of technology in a way that buttresses and reinforces a holistic and grounded sense of self, and doesn't do the opposite, right?
Yeah, because it's clear that there's been a lot of pent up anger, frustration on multiple points within the political spectrum, the social spectrum, the ethnic spectrums. And I think if we go back to the beginning, even you and I are old enough to remember the early days of the internet, how especially when Web 2.0 came and we started communicating with one another via various flavors of social networking, chatting. In the early days, it was a lot of just chatting and then chat rooms. It became almost, I don't know if scary is the right word, or I think for some people it was scary. It became very different, that all of a sudden the collective human consciousness, what we thought, what was going on in our brains as we went about our day and eating food and others, all of a sudden with that going online and being constant and permanent and as you were saying, that in one sense it connected us, but in another sense it really divided us and it made us confused. It gave us a confused cultural identity. So while it was fun for a while, and I know there are lots of groups still doing it, it was fun for a while to hear someone's random thoughts throughout the day and see pictures of their food and their vacations and things like that, like different places that they've been in the world. At least maybe for some of us that have been around a few decades, that quickly got old, and there became a desire for connection, for human connection in a virtual way, to be something different than posting pictures of food.
Right. Yep.
What have you seen as you've experimented with all the different over the last few decades here? What have you seen as both a warning and a danger for humanity around all these things as it relates to identity and virtual identity? And what have you seen that's potentially promising here?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of both, right? Like there's a lot of things that have been really negative. There's also been a lot that's been absolutely amazing. So on the negative side of things, we have the phenomenon of 4chan and these kinds of dark net, dark web kind of alleyways where people congregate and discuss really gross things. And so those hyper negative and destructive behaviors and ideas are given a voice, right? And ultimately given amplification. And so the massive spread of disinformation and lies has been, I think, especially in recent years, a major challenge and a major issue. And I think, a lot of that's going to become amplified with, and has the potential to be amplified with virtual avatars, especially as people are able to create anonymous virtual identities, right? That using the technology, you can generate a face that doesn't look like anyone, right? But looks like everyone at the same time. And so when you have if QAnon was to become a virtual avatar and starts showing up in virtual spaces and starts, right, facilitating conversations, what does that mean? I think that's an interesting question. On the flip side, well, actually, I'll stay on the negative side just one more second. The studies are very clear now. We've made the empirical connection that more time spent on social media leads to higher rates of depression and anxiety. So there's a causal connection there that's been identified. When you look at Gen Z, suicide rates have been spiking, right, over the last 7-8 years or so. Rates of depression and anxiety are higher than they've ever been, generationally speaking. We have more free time today than we've ever had in human history. We have more leisure time than we've ever had in human history. Yet our productivity has flattened. Our innovation has become stale, right? So like the kind of invention and the creativity in terms of the latent potential of humankind, I think, is being usurped by the addictive, intentionally addictive social platforms that have been created over the last 20 years. So I think there's a lot of knockout effects that are really unknown to us on a significant level. So that said, the flip side, I was speaking at a conference a couple of years ago and talking about some of these things. And afterwards, I had given my presentation. A woman walked up to me and she goes, I don't really normally do this because it's really hard for me, but she says, I'm autistic and I have a really hard time talking to people in person. And it wasn't until the internet came along that I actually found a community, because I was the only autistic person in my school. I was the only autistic person in my community. And I didn't know that there were other people like me until the internet. And when I was able to find others online around the world for the first time, I felt a sense of belonging in community. And so while, yes, maybe some of these things are really damaging for a lot of people, she's like, I attribute my life today to the community of people that I've been able to connect to via these social media technologies in these groups, right? I think there's a lot of connection. There's a lot of equity. You could say, some people would attribute the Arab Spring to Twitter, right? Some people would attribute the election of our first Black president to social media. Some people would attribute an entire new economic market and trillions of dollars of wealth creation to the idea of being an influencer, or making the tools of production to tell stories accessible to the everyday person, right? Anyone with a smartphone now can essentially become a film producer, right? And publish on YouTube or Vimeo or other networks. The amount of streaming on Twitch and these other platforms, like, it's just absolutely insane how people's lives have been changed for the better, and how entire new industries have been invented and entire new markets have been stood up, and how massive wealth has been created through these platforms. And people have been connected, and people have found a sense of belonging. People have discovered their identity. People have been given a voice. The marginalized and the oppressed of our society have been given space to express themselves and be a part of the conversation. So yeah, we could go on and on. That's the paradox, right, of this stuff, is that
So then if we were to go back to our previous conversation and loop this in to the present conversation on virtual identities, if we were to design a utopian future where identity and virtual identity was making the world a better place, uplifting humanity, what would that look like? Where would you even start to think about designing such a future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think that's that's a question I would love to investigate. I think
because it would have to start with something like, how do we collectively define flourishing as humans, right? As a healthy planet and a healthy humanity.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Are we at a place where we can come up with a collective definition that we all agree on, or at least roughly agree on? At least that's where from a heuristic perspective, that's where my brain goes. But I'd be curious actually where your brain goes to answer a question like that.
There isn't a universal definition. There are some really great precedents. I mean, I think that the most progressive maybe definition of what human flourishing looks like is probably the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I would add a few things to that. I think there's some economic, we need to ensure that there's an economic floor that socially no one exists below. I think that that there are economic rights that there currently don't exist. I think that there are also rights to access to the internet that don't currently exist. They're not codified or institutionalized in a meaningful way. I do think that access to the internet is critical. It needs to be considered a human right for the sake of human flourishing. I think that there's the Social Progress Index that's done a really good job of aggregating available data today on human prosperity. That's Michael Porter's. I think he founded that in that organization. There's a lot of indexes that have been stood up around the world measuring different aspects of human flourishing. I don't know yet if there's one that's aggregated them all, but I know that there's quite a few out there. So I think a lot of people have put a stake in what human flourishing looks like. They've defined it, they've metricized it, they've begun to index it. I think that if we're going to build technologies, specifically virtual avatars and Web 3.0 technologies that are conducive to those definitions of human prosperity and flourishing, we have to start with thinking about how might these technologies accelerate, amplify, or catalyze in a meaningful way these human rights for the most amount of people. And then what are the economic factors? So for example, $1 goes a lot farther in the global South, right? Also, a lot of the challenges that we're facing globally, ecologically, economically, and otherwise, in terms of new market opportunities, in terms of enrolling more people in school and increasing rates of literacy and education, in terms of women's rights, in terms of ethnic and cultural conflict, a lot of that exists in these pockets where $1 can go really, really far and the impact can be really, really huge, right? So I would say, where are the opportunities to invest in building technologies and tools in emerging markets that a dramatic change can be made in the quality of life for humans? That's where I would start. I would begin investigating there.
So then, because a key part of this is the childhood experience, the new generation of children being born, in as much as we can help create environments where there's nurture and support and affirmation and discipline and kind of if you think of childhood as a garden, right? The right soil and the right environment, the right conditions, the right lighting, so that our children can flourish and be educated and think creatively and think about how to design a future that is better for themselves and their communities. There's a lot of work across this, and when politics and financial challenges and inequality and inequity is happening everywhere. The human condition, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, right? The human condition has a very troubling, like, even if you just, many movies have been made around this, the running dialogue of what's going on in any particular human's mind throughout the day is a combination of terrible and horrific things and beautiful and wonderful things.
Right.
So the tilting of the scale to allow the beautiful and wonderful and creative things to come out, and even those ideas in and of themselves to flourish and be amongst us in humanity. How to design that future is an amazing conversation to get after, right? An amazing problem to get after. And so that's why I think when we're talking about virtual identities and Web3, the promise of Web3, as we think about scaling trust, as we think about decentralization, what excites us, I know, is the opportunity for that to be a power to the people, ending centralized corruption.
Yep.
But are we just moving the problem to a larger scale? Are we going to collectively invoke the dark side of humanity at scale if we decentralize everything? Or how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think what happens, though, for example, if one of the elements of decentralization is the distribution of power away from a centralized institution, that power is distributed, decision-making authority is expanded to the edge. When you look at how this has traditionally worked, when you give decision-making authority and power to those who have not previously had it, good things happen, right? So you've seen the suffrage movement, civil rights. There's even experiments today in the last 10 years around universal basic income in USAID has been just giving people unconditional money. And what's interesting is that the success rates are blowing everything else out of the water. So, from drilling new wells to giving people goats to whatever it is, in the bottom 5% of the global economy, giving those people just free unconditional money has essentially worked better than anything that's ever been done in the last 50 years in terms of outcomes. So when you give people that authority and you give them that power, good things happen. I think that there will always be the abusers of that power, right? That's just always going to be an issue. But I think we have more to gain than to lose in distributing power and decision making for people and empowering them to make their own decisions. So decentralizing that authority, I think, is going to do us a lot of good. I wanted to come back to this idea of like maybe what more acutely to focus on. I think that the conversation was pretty esoteric around human flourishing globally and that sort of thing. So maybe if I like the thought came to me to bring up Scott Barry Kaufman's work on Transcendence. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's a psychologist who studies creativity and other things. And he had the privilege of getting access to all of Maslow's unpublished journals and notebooks. So what Kaufman was able to do was to go back and revisit all of Maslow's theoretical work around the hierarchy of needs and bring modern psychology and neuroscience to bear on that. And he published a book last year called Transcendence. What Kaufman says is basically that Maslow wasn't ever trying to create a hierarchy, so to speak. That was an incomplete work. What he was trying to do was to bring shape and form to our understanding of what it meant to be a whole integrated person. And so Kaufman breaks it down into two categories: security and growth. And I think and in each of those categories break down into further categories, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but I think if we were to think about how might we direct Web 3.0 technologies towards human flourishing, I would say, how might we solve for human security and how might we solve for human growth? Those would be the things. I would go to Kaufman's work and unpack the way that he describes those things. So for example, security, self-esteem, I think, self-awareness is one of the key elements of security. Exploration is one of the key elements of growth, right? there's a lot here that I think is really interesting. It could be really helpful in directing and channeling energy around these technologies in terms of what problems we're seeking to solve with them. It would be growth and security. So I think that's a more targeted um, thing that goes back to some of the definition of human prosperity.
Because if we think about the Web3 era, if we the collective technology community are successful at this, we're going to allow people to own their data. It's going to be a new era
Yep.
of privacy
Yep.
and the ability to curate and have protection over your identity in a new. I mean, right now, identity fraud is a horrific problem.
Yep.
Even in an old school context. But in theory, in a Web3 context, if we pull it off, there will be a high degree of security and trust over our data and our opting in of different applications, different web services out there that we are allowing to access and use our data or even pay us for our data. Is there a future where as we craft identities and we have different data stores for our different facets, right? Think of the Gen Zer with 8 or 9 different Instagram accounts and Snap and TikTok. Is there a future where we're going to create whole new markets appealing to people's facets of different identities that they've crafted and data stores that they have for themselves? I'd imagine the answer is yes, that we're going to be thinking about a monetary transaction, a market between these virtual identities where computers are sort of creating and extracting and transacting value at unprecedented speeds. It's pretty insane to think about. I mean, this is where the Kanye gift to Kim is sort of spurring a lot of this thought. How are you approaching the identity data store Web3 from an ethical perspective?
I mean, I think it's already happening. Honestly, right? To some degree. I mean, think about virtual influencers. I think honestly, I'm predicting 2021 is going to be the year of the virtual influencer, right? The made up persona by some marketing company who's going to feed this thing data and create this entire fake simulated life and experience as a means of, and they're going to be using data that's being pulled from all of the predictive analytics that they have around what their audience wants to see, right? That's creating this simulated person and monetizing that, right? So like that's one kind of manifestation I think of that already. Now maybe the value exchange looks different in the future in regards to data unions and personal data ownership, and are we going to get a Facebook dividend check at the end of every year? I don't know, right? Or a Google Ads dividend check, right? Where we have some sort of data union and shared profit sharing program based on our data. But I don't know, but I do think that a lot of those structures are beginning to emerge. I think what will continue to evolve is the value exchange, whether it's going horizontally or vertically. So yeah, it's already happening.
So then when you think about a future of data privacy, Web3, decentralization, governance, where does your mind take you in terms of one, problems that are going to arise, and then two, for the entrepreneurs listening in, where are the new value that we're going to need to create? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you want me to start with decentralization specifically, or
Sure.
where's a good? Okay.
Yeah, decentralization and governance probably.
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple things come to mind. in terms of opportunities, I think community exits are going to be become the predominant paradigm as data ownership, user centric data ownership models become more prevalent. I
When
think
you
that's
say community exits, you mean just literally people leaving communities, or what do you mean by that?
Oh yeah, sorry. So I think entrepreneurs essentially and investors exiting on a sell to a community of users.
Oh, I see. I gotcha.
Um, and because again, the value exchange networks are going to look different, and that infrastructure is all being built now. So I think there's a big opportunity there to build services, platforms, technologies that help facilitate that, systems, structures, governance models that all facilitate and support that. I think that's a big opportunity. I think social coin is also going to be, in the world of crypto currency and digital ledgers and all that. Like, for example, I live in a neighborhood, just north of Seattle. I could literally create my own social coin for my neighborhood, right? And if I wanted to, there's the tools exist for me to stand up essentially a community of people using this coin to exchange different things, right? It could be built on the back of Nextdoor, right, or whatever app. I think things like that are going to become interesting, where you see these kind of new like alternative markets. Where we're using virtual currency to measure trust and value amongst communities. That's an interesting opportunity in a decentralized world. Look at just any sort of mediating system. For example, public infrastructure, right? Roads. Roads, really, there hasn't been a lot of innovation for roads, and really ever. I mean, it's very incremental innovation, right? Like, who's going to reinvent roads? I think that as the economic and political systems become more distributed and decentralized, you're going to see more authority at a state and city level for those kinds of things. You're also seeing this third sector emerge that I think we talked about last time, right? You've got a private sector, you've got a public sector, and I think we're seeing a private-public sector emerge, where we are privatizing public services, and the regulation is going to look different for those services in that sector. And so I think there's lots of opportunity there to think about, like, hey, let's reinvent roads, right? Like things like that, just very basic public infrastructure mediating systems that we have to have and operate on as a society.
Because at some point we're going to have to recognize that new economies are going to emerge, which are going to result in new value needed to be created for those economies to flourish. Right. And the technology is going to be the driver, as it really has been over the centuries, right, of creating those new markets that hopefully is making the world a better place for people. But it's really easy to lose sight if we think of sort of the USA as its own little local maxima, where we're creating new technology for the wealthy to get wealthier. One of the things I'm encouraged by young millennials and Gen Z is that there is a certain degree of social consciousness, right, both for our planet and for people who are less fortunate. And the new era of socially conscious entrepreneurs, bringing technologies like Web3 that will bring power to the people, that will have data privacy, the economic implications for the edges is important, but it's going to take people driving innovation in that direction. Like, yes, we can look to the stars and admire the Elon Musks of the world that are going to take us there, but the reality is there are billions of people impoverished around the world And if we could put that level of energy with all these new technologies into solving all those different holistic problems that we talked about earlier, that's the future I want to see. Like if you're
Right.
listening, watching to this, and if there's any possible way that you could create something to make even your hyper local community a slightly better place, that's doing your part
Right.
in humanity here. And I
Yeah.
think that's important for us to think about.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So then for you personally, then for your work, you work as a design researcher, and you're thinking about the strategy of what the future, the near and medium term future of enterprises can look like.
Hmm.
What do you see the next year? What do you see 2021 in terms of the corporate world, in terms of designing what the immediate future can look like in light of this pandemic? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Man, there's a lot. I mean, I think you see a really broad spectrum of response to COVID, and to what COVID has illuminated, right, as the challenges that need to be addressed, as well as the opportunities that are latent and yet to be taken advantage of. I think you're seeing, in some cases, on one end of the spectrum, a lot of companies are kind of retracting to the safe and the known and the comfortable, and regressing in that way. On the flip side, you see a lot of companies that are like, hey, this is the opportunity to completely reinvent what it means to be an enterprise, right? You see companies, for example, I have multiple clients who are rethinking real estate, and rethinking the purpose of the office, right? The office has been a mediating structure for collaboration and creativity and knowledge exchange and learning and socialization and focused work, for a long time. And it's also been insufficient in a lot of ways for some of those behaviors in recent years, and those activities. And so you have companies saying, do we need offices? Do we need as many offices? Could we have significant impact on the environment by reducing our real estate footprint? Could we actually exponentially elevate the quality of learning and collaboration and knowledge exchange if we provide people with tools in other ways, right, to facilitate these kinds of behaviors? I have a client the telecommunications client, right? And they're rethinking their entire technology setup. So, in the early 2000s, it became more and more common for companies to issue laptops instead of desktops, right? And now what we're seeing is, I think the next era, what you're going to see in the next year is that basic technology package is going to change. So with this telecommunications client, the question has become, hey, should we use this opportunity to reinvent our real estate model? And the conversation has moved towards no, actually it's the opportunity to reinvent your technology package, because as a telecommunications company, the promise to your customer, right, is connectivity anywhere they are. Why would you not make that same promise to your employees? Why would you have an external brand that's radically different from your internal brand? Maybe what you need to do is not rethink your real estate in the role of the office, but maybe you should give every single employee a 5G hotspot so that they can work anywhere they want and be connected and have the fastest connectivity, right? We have another client that similarly is rethinking their technology package and saying, look, basically a HoloLens needs to be standard issue to every employee. It just does. It needs to be a fundamental tool that we use. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. So I think the tool set that we're using in work is going to evolve rapidly over the next year. Where we work has already been radically disrupted, and so now the response to that is going to have some major ramifications. I think the corporate real estate, commercial real estate market is going to have some big challenges to face, but I think it's also going to be, it's a long overdue thing that we need to address in terms of, I think, the carbon impact, as well as the poor utilization of space, and what that means for OpEx and just productivity of people and social obligations, and the kind of the hierarchical panopticon of the corporate workplace in terms of management, which is another big thing that's changing. I think you're seeing, we're having multiple conversations around self-management with clients that they've never been interested in having before, even though we've been broaching the subject for years. Holacracy, humanocracy, self-management, micro enterprises, those are all things that you're going to see more of in the next year. A lot of that has to do with distributed networks and systems of power and decision making, right? So there's decentralization there. The forking and flattening of management systems. I think another big thing you're seeing, and what I think distributed work is really sparking, is a reconsideration of shared knowledge. I think that the enterprise knowledge graph is going to see a revolution in how that knowledge graph is aggregated, how it's modeled, how it's accessed, how it's shared. Radical and ripe opportunities there that a lot of companies are starting to explore. Yeah.
So if we were to any final thoughts around this whole concept of virtual identities and human flourishing in the Web3 era, in my mind, it comes back to, can we as technologists and innovators and entrepreneurs figure out a way to incentivize the best parts of humanity to arise, to be in the social spheres, to interact with each other online, and allow that collective creativity and positivity and optimism to spread? Or, right, it's going to be a balance, because obviously we're going to have, whether we like it or not, we're going to have a little bit of both. Or are we going to create a future that's going to bring out the worst in humanity, right? I think that was the collective gasp from the Web 2 era, was like, we're creating the Fortrans of the world. And even when Web 3, when Bitcoin first came out, the scare was like, dark web meets digital meets cryptocurrencies is going to even more bad things.
Yep.
So in my mind, the final thought, the call to action to entrepreneurs is, as we're building new technologies and new products and services, how are we incentivizing our customer base and the people using our applications to be good,
yeah,
to be helpful for everyone? Any final thoughts for you to the audiences listening in here?
Yeah, I have some really strong convictions about this, and I think that one of the things that leads to really hyper-destructive technologies is an unrelenting focus on optimization and monetization. The pure economic lens on generating a return, and I think is really the primary thing. And it's not just the economic lens; it really is a data issue. I think that the over-indexing on data optimization is ultimately what leads to a lot of destructive technology. Now, let me unpack this a little bit. I think here's what I think needs to happen. I think that we are in an era that we have a choice. There's a fork in the road here. We can continue on one path to go down the road of dataism and really just go all in, cash all our chips on empirical evidence, right? And allow dataism and our empiricism to really drive derivative product development and social evolution. The other path is imagination And I think we need to really reconsider our commitment to dataism. I think that dataism has completely atrophied our corporate and social imagination. We're so committed to the empirical. We're so committed to the prove it, right? Especially in the technology world, that unless you can prove an idea, unless you can say this makes money, then it's not worth anything. It's not worth pursuing. And I think we need to create more space to pursue more things that are less empirical. But before we even do that, we need to loosen our grip on dataism and empiricism and create some more space for what I've been calling dream thinking. We need to encourage and really support the imaginative exploration of utopian futures, because systems change is always an emergent property of a story's change. We need to tell new stories. We need to explore new stories of what's possible. We need to cultivate a faith in the possibility of the impossible. We need to provoke dreaming and utopianism. And I think, a lot of those things, and utopian thinking has a bad rap, but I think we've lost sight of it. We've become so saturated with data. We've lost our ability to go beyond the feasible, right? And that's where we need to start. I think we need to unshackle ourselves from feasibility and viability, and just dream for a while and practice dream thinking and embrace those functional fictions and engage with each other and sharing these narratives and these stories. Let's tell a new story first about the future we want to create, and then go build the things, right? So I think that's what we need more than ever. I
like it. Joel, we will put links to everything we just talked about, or as much as possible, into our show notes. And I think the call to action for us as investors, entrepreneurs, creators, thinkers, designers, is a grand one. And I think those listening and watching to this have been, at the very least, a glimpse into the ways that you and I are thinking about this, and the ways that others are potentially getting the word out here. So thank you for your time. This has been a great part 2, and I will look forward to part 3. If any of you have questions or comments on this, feel free to reach out to us. You can find me at WC Little on Twitter. And Joel, how can people find you online?
JoelFariss.com.
Wonderful. All right, Joel, really appreciate your time. This has been great.
Yeah, super fun. Thanks, Will.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number 1, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups, and health science, and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number 2, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you in your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.